Well, good evening or good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Christmas 2022 session of Have We Got Planning News for You? Would you believe it's episode 7 of season 8? Doesn't time fly when you're having fun? As ever, we encourage you to make a donation to a charity of your choice, whether it's Shelter, National Energy for Action, or Help the Ukraine Emergency, or Brian May Save Me Trust, or indeed a charity of your local choice. Now, when you are reflecting on this year, as I'm sure you will be in due course, you will be remembering not only the 3 prime ministers that we have had, but I think you'll also all be remembering the boomerang Secretary of State for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, none other than Michael Gove. After all, he started the year as Secretary of State, was sacked by Boris in July, replaced by Greg Clark. Liz Truss then replaced him by Simon Clarke. And then, of course, Rishi boomeranged back Michael Gove. And since then, we have had all manner of interesting signalling as to the changes that lie ahead. And who better to discuss that signalling with than our special guest this evening, Catriona Riddell, Strategic Planner Supremo is how I'm going to summarize her before I come to interview her in a little more depth later on in the program. But she will be with us to discuss recent events. So welcome, Catriona, back. I should say back. You know, you are in a very elite group because we are welcoming you back onto the show. And would you like to just tell us, if it's not obvious already to all of our guests, what our theme is, what your theme is, where you are joining us from, and what you're drinking?
Yep. Well, it's Christmas, so the theme is Christmas, of course. Yeah, I was going to say Chris, and Sasha's let us down big time. He says he doesn't do Christmas jumpers.
He's too sensible. He's too sensible.
So I'm joining you, as always, from Thames Ditton. Haven't moved. No houses around here to move to. And I've gone old school.
Oh, classy. I love a lady with class. I've
got a Christmas party later, so I thought, why not?
Marvellous. Well, it's wonderful to see you again. Well, King of the North, yes, you may well take your specs off. Do I really look like that?
This is the most awesome hat I've ever bought. It's fantastic. I'm going to wear this for the rest of the year. Hello, guys. It's lovely to see you, and happy Christmas to everybody. Let me be the first to wish you that on this show. I'm in Lancashire, as you can probably see, and yes, I've got the mistletoe out. I've got the hat on, and I don't know if you can see the shirt. Christmas is coming.
Christmas is coming.
Oh, sorry, and yes, I'm also drinking. I asked somebody to get me a horrible beer, and this looks like a horrible beer. It's called Chorbros New Zealand IPA. I intend to feel horrible on it in about 3 or 4 minutes. But it's a delight.
You never know. That might be quite nice. That might be quite nice. What about you, young Sasha? Where you look like you're in Landmark.
No, I'm not. I'm at home.
You're at home. I do beg your pardon.
Delight. I'm going out to a public inquiry later on. But I'm in Oxfordshire, and I'm being the Grinch or the Scrooge or whatever my wife usually calls me with my lack of Christmas stuff. But no, I'm intellectually buying into Christmas, if not physically, at the moment. And I am drinking a lovely, lovely cup of tea out of my favourite mug, Southern Railways, when the railway used to work, or we used to have a railway.
Well, it's great to see you. And young Chris.
Hello, Mary. Hello, and hello. I got to ask Sasha, what do you mean you're going to an inquiry later? Is that right?
I'll explain offline, yeah.
Okay, all right. That sounds odd. Yeah, I've been doing an inquiry at Somerset, but I'm back at home with Presumption. He's completely in the Christmas mood. He is drinking stocking filler.
Oh,
whereas I've got a cold
turkey.
So, yeah. Oh, my goodness. I only just made that. Been doing the school run. It is murder out there. Crikey. We've got loads of snow and ice, and I've only just made it back in time. But looking forward to the show.
Well, it's lovely to see you. And may I say that I went to this is a digression. I digress to tell you that I went to the ballet last week and I saw the Nutcracker, and there was a huge presumption on stage. And I thought, wow, that must be Chris's presumption.
Must be.
Yeah. Anyway, so
I can't do a nutcracker. I could do a nut roast.
Nut roast. Goodness me. Endless supply.
Right. Well, we must crack by the end of this.
We must crack on. Viewers, as you will have gathered, listeners, Mr. Banner is not with us currently, but he will, thanks to the superb technology on this show, he will be joining us later to discuss one of his cases. But we're going to start with Sasha, who's going to take us to Swansea Bay and the tidal lagoon.
What would we prefer, what would we like more than on this lovely evening than thinking about being in the middle of Swansea Bay? And I'm going to talk about the tidal bay, the lagoon, the tidal lagoon, as it's rather grand. I mean, it slightly reminds me, you think it's something in Australia, don't you? A tidal lagoon. But no, Swansea Bay. This was actually a £1.3 billion project. And what happened in 2014 is the company promoting this had the bright idea, understandably, to go down the DCO route, and they got a DCO to build this magnificent, sustainable project. That's the good news. Then the bad news, and it is not being party to this, something obviously happened, some politics, etc., but there was obviously a slight cold feet about implementation of the proposal. Now, the fundamental question here is what, in the context of a DCO, how do you effectively commence or begin the proposal? We're all familiar in the planning context with the requirement, usually in condition 1, to commence the proposal. In this case, it all revolved around the provisions of the Planning Act 2008. And for the lawyers who are listening in, the provisions are particularly encapsulated in section 154 and 155 about how you actually commence. And there are provisions that will deal with this. However, there's also the ability under the Act and regulations for the DCO itself to have its own bespoke date. And that's what happened in this case. There was a bespoke date, and actually the use in the DCO related to when it commenced. So the Court of Appeal had to wrestle with effectively the interaction of the wording used in the DCO as opposed to the Act. And effectively, the promoters of the scheme were arguing that the Act effectively took precedent, and the Court of Appeal took the view that no, the DCO, which had bespoke provisions dealing with commencement, and that was effectively when it began, that should take priority. And the bottom line, incredibly, is that the view was taken that the DCO had not been successfully commenced or began or implemented. And it is noteworthy, of course, there's a lot of politics involved, as I understand it, with funding. But just, I don't know if Rob can put back the stellar cast of characters, but it is noteworthy. It's quite an impressive list. I know Michael Humphreys was for the claimant in this matter, Mr. DCO, but it is noteworthy that, look at the cast of opponents, the British or the UK Secretary of State, the Welsh ministers and the city itself. So quite a powerful coalition of those saying that effectively the DCO had not started. So frankly, I think the takeout for those who have got DCOs is look very carefully at what has been effectively, what clauses are imposed when the DCO is granted as to whether it affects the section 154 and 155. Thank you.
And by the way, it's a pretty powerful court, Master on the Rolls and Sir Keith Limblom. But yes, it's interesting that DCOs or those who have the benefit of a DCO can lose it, just as those who have the benefit of a planning permission can also sometimes lose it. Thank you very much, Sasha. Over to you, Paul. You're going to whisk us down to mid-Devon to talk about some solar panels.
I am, and I'm going to be serious about this one.
Oh. Ooh.
If that's at all possible. So this is a decision of the Secretary of State granted on the 5th of December, following a recommendation from Inspector Ware, who produced his report 3 months before that, following a 3-day inquiry in June of this year. It's a proposal for a 60-hectare solar farm and battery storage facility, generating up to 49.9 megawatts. That's important because that puts it just directly below the threshold of 50 megawatts, which would have taken it into a DCO, which tells you what the industry thinks of DCOs and the preference for the ordinary planning system. It was a proposal for 40 years, and it was recommended for approval by Mid-Devon officers and in a location called Langford in Devon. Well, it was refused by members, contrary to that recommendation, on the grounds of landscape, agricultural land quality and heritage. But by the time of the inquiry, in fact, very shortly after the refusal, the council had received advice once the appellant appealed that they were in dire straits, and they formally conceded that they weren't going to oppose the appeal. So how did a 3-day inquiry arise, you might ask? After the council wrote a very detailed statement of case, essentially conceding all the grounds. Well, the reason why there was an inquiry was because CPRE Devon, and it's important to note CPRE Devon, not CPRE National, had been granted Rule 6 status to oppose the scheme. The grounds on which they were opposing the scheme was supportive of the councillor's reasons for refusal, but encompassed, uniquely in my experience, in 2022, part of their case was that the climate change emergency was bogus. That it wasn't based on evidence, and they were opposing the existence of climate change. Now, that set them in direct conflict with CPRE nationally, who are committed to combating climate change. And indeed, Mid-Devon have said in terms, Devon CPRE have said in terms, they disagree with the stance of the national body, and they relied upon what they said was a more robust evidence base. Philip Ware was having none of it, and on the basis that national policy is firmly grounded in seeking to combat climate change, and that's, I'm afraid, an argument that fell on deaf ears. But the jumping around in the face of evidence seems to be in a bit of a thread of the case being put by Devon CPRE, because they also said that they took issue with the agricultural land quality specialists who were saying that this was grade 3 and below agricultural land quality. They didn't have any evidence to the effect that it was grade 3 and below, but they disbelieved that it was grade 3 and below. And then they also took issue with the position with regard to heritage and landscape. It was a surprising stance by a Rule 6 party. And one could see, given the fervour with which the points were being put, why it was that perhaps councillors were swung in their initial decision. Well, the inspector recommended, and the Secretary of State agreed, that given the very localised nature of the landscape and visual impacts, given the nil effect on heritage, and given the strong policy support for renewable energy, that the proposals, notwithstanding they covered 60 hectares worth of Devon countryside, would be in conformity with the development plan. And because of that, recommended approval, but also said, even if it hadn't been in conformity because of landscape impacts, the public benefits would have outweighed any harm which arose, and the Secretary of State agreed with that. There was also a costs award, a full costs award against Devon Council, up to the point at which they handed in their surrender for the costs up to that point, and also the costs of dealing with conditions and obligations. And there's two oddities that are worth flagging up here. The first of which is that the argument was being put that Devon had done the right thing once it took advice that their reasons for refusal weren't sustainable. And what the inspector said about that was, the cost regime is intended to bring a degree of rigour to the process, and it cannot possibly be right that an authority which makes an unreasonable decision should then be exempt from costs simply because it then subsequently changes its position. Now, that's a really powerful statement, and one that, frankly, should be out there in the public domain. But this is my second point, and this is where there's a problem, which is that when you go on the applications and the call in the recovered site from the department, it puts the decision on, but it doesn't put the cost decision on. Now, if the costs regime is intended to give some degree of rigour and scrutiny to the decision-making of local planning authorities, which is one of the most fundamental reasons for having it, then it needs to be out there in the public domain and easily assessed. So since our boomerang Secretary of State is back in position, one reform which he may want to think about is putting the cost decisions on the website so they're readily available, so that officers can put those cost decisions on their reports. And in fact, in this case, officers did recommend to members that they were at risk as to cost, but this would give the next officer making such a recommendation a bit more grist to his elbow to try and twist the arms of members and frankly save some public money, and let's get these things consented to try and transform the energy market in the UK. Thank you very much, Mary.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you very much. And one of our listeners has said, "What no costs in terms of CPRE?" And no seems to be the answer to that. So, from a renewable energy, we are now going to be whisked to discuss the very opposite of that, namely the Whitehaven decision. And here we go to Charlie. So we just pause 1 second, and we will be seeing Charlie summarising this case for us.
Hello and greetings from Finchley, where it's so cold I'm having to wear my coat indoors to stay remotely warm. I'm sorry I can't be with you for the live show today, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about the recent high-profile and controversial decision by the Secretary of State in a call-in case concerning a proposed coal mine, Whitehaven in Cumbria. As I said, the decision's been widely reported, but not all of that reporting is entirely fair. The impression that some reports are given is the Secretary of State went out on a frolic of his own, went out on a limb and granted permission for an environmentally very damaging proposal. But in fact, the decision was in accordance with the recommendation of the Secretary of State's inspector, who wrote a comprehensive report based upon over 4 weeks of evidence at inquiry from over a dozen expert witnesses, and there were 4 represented parties at the inquiry. Now, a key aspect of the Secretary of State's decision was that the coal mine, which was for coking coal for the manufacture of steel, was unlikely to materially impact the demand for steel. And as a result of that, the effect of the development would not be to overall increase the greenhouse gas and carbon emissions of the steel manufacture industry, which wouldn't increase materially as a result of the development. All this mine would do would be to compete for other existing mines already servicing that particular industry sector. And unlike the existing metallurgical coal mines that were servicing the steel manufacture industry, this one, so the inspector and the Secretary of State found, would be broadly carbon neutral as a result of a combination of methane capture and offsetting. So the overall effect of this coal mine would be to increase the environmental performance, increase the climate performance of the particular sector. And that was a particularly persuasive factor for the Secretary of State in his decision, along with the over 500 jobs that would be created in the Northwest, something doubtless of political significance to the Secretary of State for levering up, as well as something which achieved planning significance in the decision. So it's a curious factor that these aspects of the decision, the fact that the Secretary of State wasn't going on a frolic of his own, but in fact was following the evidence-based report of his expert inspector, who'd heard a wide range of expert evidence at inquiry. That wasn't really communicated by the department. So certainly what the impression one gets is it wasn't, because it doesn't really feature in any of the main reports, which describe the decision in terms that one would get the impression the Secretary of State was going off on a limb of his own. It is a curious feature of the decision that it was published only a day or two after the high-profile announcements about national policy on housing. That was perhaps a bit of a PR own goal and could have been avoided. But in substance, this is a fairly mainstream vanilla planning decision, given the recommendation of the inspector and the wide range of evidence which he based his recommendation on.
Well, wasn't that wonderful? Lovely bit of coat, that nice little velour collar, very smart. So now we go to Chris, and we're sticking with our theme. This time we're going to carbon captured gas-fired generating stations.
Before we do, though, Mary, can Chris say, did you like my Christmas present to give you such a lovely light read?
Yeah, that was wonderful. And I'd just like to say that this is, some people say that DCOs aren't that interesting, but it's 725 pages. I have to say, I'm so very grateful to you, Sasha. It's been absolutely fascinating. And if you do read these DCOs, which we don't cover as often as we might, they are quite a dry read. And I've very much enjoyed this one. So thank you very much, Sasha. Yes, that's right. We're dealing with, it's all energy, isn't it? Apparently, we're trying to keep the lights on, I think, is probably why these are all being granted. It was this is the Keadby 3 carbon capture power station. And that excited me. I thought, oh, wow, a carbon capture power station, what's that? But actually, it's a gas-fired power station with a few carbon capture features. So that's what we've just allowed through this DCO. The Secretary of State for Business has allowed a gas-fired power station. It will generate 910 megawatts for the enthusiast, and it's equipped with carbon capture and compression plants and fueled by natural gas with connections for cooling water, electrical, gas and utilities, construction, laydown and associated infrastructure. Now, the inspector who considered this was Christopher Butler. There was an examination and all the main issues that would expect were there: air quality, biodiversity, and landscape and so on. But crucial here, I think, is the issue about climate change. So without going through all of the detail about the various aspects of the habitat regulations and so on, there are issues about putting the water, the warmed water back into the River Trent and the marine effect, is what the Secretary of State had to say about carbon capture. Because this is not something I know a great deal about. It was under the heading of climate change. And this will obviously be gas powered. And what the Secretary of State said was, well, we need to be having a transition away from fossil fuels, but that won't happen overnight. So we're going to continue to need electricity from fossil fuels, and low carbon sources such as gas are to be preferred, obviously, over coal, although we've heard that coal is now favoured as well. And then this, because I was interested in what the carbon capture actually amounts to. And the Secretary of State noted that the conditioned and dehydrated CO2 produced from the plant would be compressed and metered and then discharged into the CO2 gathering network for onwards transmission to an offshore carbon store for permanent storage and not released into the atmosphere. For offshore carbon store, probably read Africa, and the consenting carbon network would be subject to a separate DCO. The overall case that was made for why it wouldn't have a negative impact in terms of climate change was that it was only 1% of the UK's carbon emissions. So that's obviously what makes it acceptable if it's just a small percentage of the national carbon contribution. But yes, it was an interesting read, and I haven't quite captured the essence of it there, I don't think. But thank you very much, Sasha, for all 725 pages.
Happy Christmas, my friend.
Well, keen listeners will have worked out that Sasha dishes out the work chores and Chris is feeling a little hard done by this week. Well done, Chris. That was an excellent summary, and we salute you for getting to the bottom of that. So onwards and upwards, and let's focus again back to our very special guest. So, Catriona, I'm just going to introduce you a little bit more because some of our viewers may not be that familiar with you. You are, to quote Chris, the undisputed Queen of Strategic. I rather like that, Queen of Strategic. You are the ex-head of strategic planning at Surrey County Council. Also, you held the position of Director of Planning with the South East England Regional Assembly, that body that some of us are old enough to remember well. You are currently a strategic planning specialist at the Planning Officers Society. You're vice chair of the Town and Country Planning Association, and you are a member of the Royal Town Planning Institute's England Policy Panel. And this has been quite a special year for you, Catriona. You've been awarded an honorary doctorate by Oxford Brookes for services to planning. You've become a fellow of the Royal Town Planning Institute, and you've been named in the planners list of women of influence for your work in strategic planning. So may I say, first of all, on behalf of all of us, congratulations for all those achievements this year. They are all in recognition of a long and successful career in strategic planning, and we wish you many more years.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been a good year.
Yeah, well, it seems to me that you are a particularly appropriate guest at this moment in time, when we have heard this week from Michael Gove, and indeed the week before. So my questions to you are unsurprisingly going to be focusing on what we have learnt recently. So my first question to you is, has Michael Gove, do you think, got it right when he said in his recent letter to MPs of the current planning system, and I quote, "It does not provide the right homes in the right places, and at worst, risks imposing ever more stretching housing targets that are out of touch with reality, leading to developers taking advantage through planning by appeal and speculative development."
Ooh, start with the big one, eh? Was he right? I think he's right in some ways. I think he's right in his assessment of the current system doesn't always result in the right houses in the right places, and I think we know that. And you know, my bag is strategic planning, and one of the reasons that's happening is because we don't have an effective approach to that. So we end up with a lot of development in the least worst places as opposed to the best places, and I think that he's absolutely right with that. I think he's probably a bit too harsh on developers in terms of speculative development. You know, I think it's an easy target, isn't it? Planning inspectors and developers are an easy target. And the minute you start scratching beneath the surface, you know that there's absolutely no evidence for a lot of what he's saying. But he's also very right in terms of local communities feeling very left out. You know, localism overpromised and really overpromised, and I think we're paying the price of that now.
Yes, I like that. That is a good turn of phrase. Localism overpromised. And I just observed that they don't keep stats on the number of appeals that relate to allocated sites versus the number of appeals on speculative sites. If they kept those stats and they published them, then they might have some evidence on which to base those comments. Okay, my next question is about what we might see in the National Planning Policy Framework Prospectus, which is due to be published. And do you think that the government is likely to hang on to the 300,000 a year target or ditch it?
Well, I heard today, actually, that the Housing Minister said in his comments this week that they were sticking with the 300,000 target. So it's there, it's still there. The gap between how they do that and how they do it through local plans is going to be an awful lot bigger now. So the mountain they're going to have to climb is going to be an awful lot bigger. And, you know, we'll see what the NPPF prospectus says, how much detail it will actually have in terms of what the NPPF itself is going to, or a redraft of the NPPF is going to say. We've got a lot of local elections in May. An awful lot of councils have got full out elections where all their members are up for election, a lot of them in the South East. How much Michael Gove will want to say before then is going to be interesting as well. So whether this prospectus is sort of delaying tactics, sort of it's another consultation, it's not the full NPPF. And there's some really big questions in there. You know, what will replace the duty to cooperate? Because they're going to have to do something.
Indeed. And I just want to read out this observation from one of our listeners, Chris France, who says housing in the wrong place is simply down to the tilted balance, which is the product of Michael Gove's government's national policy. It doesn't mean the planning system is broken per se. Touche, I say to you, Chris. Touche. Yeah. So do you think the government will abandon the standard method? And if not, what changes do you think to calculating local housing need would actually be helpful at this point?
I don't think they'll abandon it. I think they've made it quite clear they're going to stick with some sort of national target. The formula, I think, underpinning it needs to be updated. There's no argument. I think the demographics underpinning it are way out of date, and that's been one of the real challenges. I think Michael Gove said in October that he wants the formula to put houses where they want the jobs to go, as opposed to where the jobs are now, and that's all part of the levelling up. So he's going to have to come up with something that redistributes growth across the country. He's also going to have to think about something that works across the country. And I think as much as it was in everybody's interest to have some sort of standard formula, so we don't end up arguing in local plan examinations, it's really hard to do that in a very diverse country, which has very different needs. And I think that's where it's got unstuck. I actually like the idea of bringing back something like, if you remember, those long on the tooth will remember the national, what was it called, NPOW, National Planning and Housing Advisory Unit, which was government, and that they actually set the starting point for regional assemblies. But it was a more sophisticated approach than the standard methodology. So it had a demographic starting point, household projections and things, and it did look absolutely at affordability, but it was more sophisticated. And that number was then the starting point for how you fitted that in to each of the regions. So if they're going to keep a standard methodology, I think they need to be a little bit more sophisticated around what that means across a very diverse country. And how much that's going to be, how flexible that's going to be at a local plan level. Because I think if you're going to have a standard methodology, it should be tested at a sub-regional level, not a local level.
Well, I'm not going to I'm not going to jump ahead with a question I know that's coming in relation to regional government. Okay. I just want to ask you about Gove's. He made a written statement on the 8th of December about devolution. And in that, he talked about trailblazing deep devolution. And he suggested that, and this is all around Manchester and the combined authorities up there, and he indicated that his trailblazing deep devolution was going to include not only transport, but also housing. And I wonder if that is the direction of that the government is going in as a backstop or an alternative to regional government, because it seems to me that they're not going to want to get into the whole sub-regional thing, bearing in mind they abolished it and brought in localism. So do you think that trailblazing the deep devolution is the answer?
It could be, but it's not at the moment. I mean, what's been proposed through the devolution framework is housing, but it's about housing delivery with local authorities and combined authorities, and transport, climate change, some specific issues. There's nothing in there that joins these up, and there's nothing in there about planning. There's nothing in there about spatial planning. So there's nothing about saying you will have a role in terms of deciding how much and where that housing goes. It's very much about delivering it as the other end of the spectrum. And, you know, you've got about 3 or 4 different types of devolution now. So you've got mayoral combined authorities, you've got combined authorities without a mayor. You're now going to have, as a result of the new the lower county combined authorities, and then you've also got devolution deals in the way that they're being done through Suffolk and Norfolk, which is not about a combined authority, it's just a devolution deal. But you also have then a choice of how far in terms of leadership you're going to go in order to get more goodies. So Suffolk and Norfolk, for example, are looking at an elected mayor. But at the end of the day, the devolution framework sets out what the choices they have, and planning is at the moment not in there. So the only route they've got is through combined authority spatial development strategies, through the existing mayoral combined authorities. And there's only one doing that, and that's Liverpool City Region. Andy Street from the West Midland one wears the fact he doesn't have any planning powers like a badge of honour. He's always the first to jump in on arguments around greenbelt and planning, but he does not want any planning powers. So, you know, either the government's going to have to say all combined authorities, all devolution deals have to have strategic planning powers, whether you like it or not, or it's not going to deliver on what we need it to deliver.
Yeah, I mean, there's going to have to be some give and take, isn't there? Because if they want to keep at the 300,000 target, and at the same time, it feels as if they're trying to send a message that if you are in AOMBs or if you are in very constrained greenbelt areas, you don't need to provide all your local needs. Then they need to incentivize some to pick up more, take up some of that slack.
Yeah, and levelling up, what does that mean in terms of housing distribution? You know, I'm a fan of having some form of national spatial strategy, especially now. If we're going to actually redistribute across the country, then we need a mechanism to do that. Now, whether that's through big regional bodies and devolution as Labour are sort of advocating, or is it about having some form of national strategy that the standard methodology and the formula can then underpin, which redistributes it away from the overheated southeast, as they argue, and shifts it to where there's apparently a lot more choice around brownfield sites and more opportunities.
Yes, indeed. And again, we've got some great comments here, audience. Keep them coming. Mark Sullivan makes the observation that back in the day when you were at Surrey County Council, you were doing your own demographic work, and there was no need in that world to rely on ONS projections, which have caused quite a lot of angst around this whole issue. So yes, thank you very much, Mark, for that contribution.
That's actually not true, because actually for the last 40 odd years numbers have been given nationally. So our numbers in the structure plan, for example, came through regional planning guidance, which was government policy. So it was actually set through government and allocated to each structure plan authority. We had a role through bodies like SERPLAN, so we had it was a sort of bottom-up, top-down approach, but actually the number was a demographic graphic number, and it was actually handed out by government. So we've had this for years.
Yes. Liz is talking about the importance of demographic work helping the NHS. I mean, I feel that insurance companies, pension funds, hedge funds, they have access to data. One wonders why public authorities don't have access to similar data. If we could open up that, access to the right data, we could no doubt improve our planning.
We need good demographers, though. All local authorities, county councils used to have their own demographic teams that could understood the demographics. yes, true. True. So, what an interesting episode this is. So, next question. Do you think it's helpful to have the bar for local plans lowered by removing from the soundness test the needs for plans to be justified, as hinted at? Yeah, it's a bit of an interesting one, isn't it? What does justified mean? Does it mean justified to who? Who do we need to justify it for? I mean, I really like the change in terms of that test of soundness that they made a couple of years or so ago, which went from the most appropriate to inappropriate.
Yes.
That one word, I think, made all the difference. And that makes absolute sense, because there's no more than one strategy that can deliver the same result. Taking away the word justified, it depends what tests of soundness or tests are going to put in its place. And I think the 2020 white paper suggested that they would have some high-level environmental outcomes, and there was lots of debate about whether that would be good enough. I really like the idea of having what we used to do with regional strategies and national guidance, as well as structure plans and national guidance, which was general conformity. So you had to actually show harm to national policy in order to fail, because we've sort of got to get a better balance between what local plans are delivering in the national interest and what they're delivering in the local interest. And I think a lot of the concern from local communities, and actually I think a lot of planners as well, is that we've gone too far the other way. It's all set in the MPPF. The bar is quite high in terms of what a local plan does to do things in terms of the national interest. So I think we need to get the balance right. The word justified, taking it away will depend on what they replace it with. I don't understand why they've got such a bee in their bonnet about that word, to be honest.
Me neither. And also I feel that actually it's only through explaining and justifying your strategy that you can really hope to win hearts and minds locally. If you don't have to justify your decisions, there's less transparency. I think it's harder for local businesses, local people, residential population to actually understand what is behind the plan.
Yeah. I mean, we shouldn't have to justify doing a local plan. It's a requirement. We have to do it. And you know, I'm so confused about why they've made such a big deal about this one single word, because I think it actually, in the bigger scheme of things, doesn't make any sense. There must be some discussion that's gone on behind there about why that word has to be removed. But I don't understand why, frankly.
Yes.
But I do agree the test of soundness perhaps are not, there's too much for misinterpretation and different interpretations in terms of the test of soundness. When the current local plan, I think, system really was introduced in 2004, the shift from an local plan inquiry to an examination was supposed to be allowing for a more less adversarial process, and I think we never mastered that at all.
I'd like to pause and just reflect on that answer, if I may, because I mean, I remember the day when local plan examinations were like a series of Section 78 appeals, and people called evidence that's subject to cross-examination, and inspectors wrote individual reports dealing with, you know, the pros and cons of the allocated sites. Then we moved into a world where the inspectors took charge, and there was a sort of presumption, if you like, of soundness, and it was very much for the objectors in the room to try and demonstrate to an inspector that the plan wasn't sound. And it feels to me that you might say it's worked in the sense that there's less formality and everyone's around the table together. And what Chris Young says and what Paul Tucker says is just as important as what, you know, CPRE Devon say, or the chair of a parish council. Everyone's, I feel that the current system is quite different to the more adversarial system that we started with when I first came in to the bar. I can see Sasha's disapproving of what I'm saying. We might come back to that topic, but let me move on, because one of the other things that's definitely coming down the line, which I think is perhaps less controversial, is the idea of new national development management policies. So my question to you is, what do you think will be the likely scope of new national development management policies? And do you think there's a risk that they might curtail the freedom of expression that currently local planning authorities have?
I read a lot of local plans in my job, and there is a huge amount of duplication in terms of where's greenbelt policies and things like that. Now, there are some subtleties, but generally, if you're implementing national policy, you pretty much say the same thing. So, you know, we don't need a lot of the development management policies we need. But I think there is a concern. So they're introducing new supplementary guidance, which is going to be it's going to play a much bigger role, I think, in order to allow flexibility in terms of policy reviews. And I think that's really important in terms of things like net zero, climate change, sustainable construction. So I think that we need to make sure that we don't lose the flexibility to respond to changing policy needs over time, because things are changing really quickly in the planning world and in the construction world, and we need to make sure that any development management policies set at a national level don't stifle that innovation and that flexibility. So I don't think they'll be wide-ranging. We'll see, hopefully, the scope of them next week when it's published in the prospectus, but I think it would be quite foolish to have a wide-ranging number of national development management policies. I think it would be quite hard to manage it as well, especially if you've got to review them regularly and keep them up to date.
Yeah. But things like perhaps, as you say, Greenbelt heritage. I mean, we almost had, we had, it seemed to me before the MPPF, we were in a world where we actually did have national heritage policies, and they were quite successful. I would have thought that's another topic that lends itself.
Areas of outstanding natural beauty,
yes, exactly.
Things like that. The other one, I get involved in safeguarding mineral sites is another one. I think nationally, it's in the national interest to safeguard aggregates. So something around that, I think, is a common feature in a lot of local plans, minerals and waste minerals local plans. So something around that, I think, would be useful. That's also really useful in terms of the two-tier areas where there's quite often conflict between what the districts want to do in terms of safeguarding sites or not safeguarding sites, using them for residential, and the Minerals Authority that wants to safeguard the aggregates. So something at a national level around that, I think, would be useful.
Excellent. Do you welcome the further prioritisation of brownfield land? And will it make a difference, do you think, a positive difference to the delivery of homes and jobs?
How much more can we prioritise brownfield sites? We've been saying it for years and years and years, and we have had a brownfield site first approach for a long, long time. My concern, again, is that we've shifted the balance a bit too far. So we're seeing a lot of brownfield sites in the middle of nowhere, former airfields, for example, without naming names, that are in the middle of nowhere, but because they're classed as brownfield, they get priority over perhaps a greenfield site that's closer into an urban area that is far cheaper to develop. There's some airfields that you've got to think about the sudden shift in terms of resources for transport to try and make these work, to try and make these a bit more connected. And it's purely on the back of the fact that they are brownfield sites. So I think there's categories within brownfield that we need to be very careful about. On the whole, I've got no problem with it. I think it's the right thing, reuse of land, but it's been around a long time. We just have to think about the financing of it now, and how we if we're going to really prioritise it in that sense, then we really need to focus the finances on that.
Okay. Is it fair, do you think, to penalise developers for slow build-out rates, given the impact of market forces, including trust economics?
I've just been reading some stuff today about land banking. Again, it's rhetoric, isn't it? Planning is full of rhetoric.
Planning and politics. Great bedfellows.
Yeah, it's great. And we talk about land banking, and we know developers and house builders will say we don't land bank. There's no financial there's no financial gain for us to land bank. There is in some areas that sites take longer, and local authority developers like to have a portfolio of sites and things like that ready to go. And there's some are developed faster than others, but I mean, on the whole, I don't think land banking in the bigger scheme of things is a big issue, and we've had previous studies on that, government studies on that, and there's no real evidence of that. I get worried that again, the rhetoric is coming hard for developers. We are going into a recession. We need to support the development industry as much as we can. We've seen downturns. We've seen the damage that downturns in house building has on the economy as a whole. And I think the government needs to be very, very careful how they work with house builders at the moment. There needs to be a really strong partnership there.
Thank you. Now, I'm just going to open this up. I might come back with 1 or 2 more questions at the end, but let's open it up. Sasha, do you have a question here for Catriona?
I do, Mary, I do. And I'm afraid I just have to nail my colours to the mast, having promoted various plans through the old system. I thought it was time consuming, but it came up with much better policy that was resilient to testing, which we used to do. But I know time has moved on. But Catriona, can I ask, I want to ask the fundamental issue, which is a real bugbear of mine, of all of us that work in planning, is how can we change the perception, frankly, from the outside world that planning is a force that is damaging, comes up with the wrong solutions, and frankly, not particularly good products. The public fear what we do. They don't like it. And that has been a complete wave of feeling over the last 10 to 15 years. So how do we change that narrative and get people to embrace planning?
Oh, that's a doozy, isn't it? When I came into planning 100 years or so ago, planning was a force of good. It was a positive role. It was something that, you know, it was about good place shaping. It was about creating good places. We did a lot of work with local communities. It was a very different place to where it is today. And as you say, the value of planning and planners as a result, particularly local authority planners, is at an all-time low. A part of that, again, is back to right to the start, I think, is that promise of localism and local communities having a say on how much new development happens, being rewarded in terms of taking development with the right infrastructure. And, you know, in the best world in the world, we don't have the money to pay for all the infrastructure that's needed to support development, and the developers pay an awful lot of that. And that's something we need to remind local communities. You won't have a lot of what you get to support your communities without having new development. So I think, you know, we've got a really big challenge on our hands to try and really increase the value of planning, and keep planners and local authorities thinking that they have got a really valuable role to play in that. You know, we are there to create good places in the public interest. And that is only going to happen if we work with developers, councillors work with developers, councils work with their own planners, work with communities, and this becomes a much more partnership-led approach. You know, Michael Gove's absolutely right. Local communities do feel they've been hard done to in terms of plan making, particularly. And that's their fault. That's the government's fault. This goes back 10 years ago when you know, local authorities now have to do all the heavy lifting. They used to have some of the really difficult decisions were taken at a higher level, still through local authorities, but now every local planning authority is pretty much making all the decisions and all the hard decisions, and it's not a good place to be if you were a councillor or a planner. So I think we've got a huge challenge on our hands to get this back, and it's going to take an awful long time to get it back. Meanwhile, we're losing graduates, we're losing you know, people coming into the profession because it's hard. It's really hard. It's not rewarding for a lot of planners and local authorities. So we need to really work hard, but it's going to have to be a partnership approach from everybody involved, and that includes the communities. And I don't think social media helps. I think you know, the first thing I ever do when I'm working in a local area is go on Twitter to see what campaign groups there are out there, because I know that's where a lot of the information is, but B, that's where you know, the flack is, and where the clear sort of arguments are going to be. And social media has been incredibly harmful to planning and planners, I think.
Agreed. Yeah.
Well, we must move on. Chris, you have a question. Thank you very much, Sasha.
Oh goodness, where to start with all this? Honest to goodness, do you know what? I mean, in the fight, but this is all going national, isn't it? In the Financial Times today, Helen Thomas has written an article just on your brownfield point. You're spot on. How many times have we heard this recycled? She says the reiteration of the hackneyed old platitude of brownfield first won't help. The lessons of New Labour's emphasis on brownfield sites are, say, Lichfield, who they've been speaking to, that it's often interpreted as greenfield never. In addition, many brownfield sites are unsuitable for housing or in existing commercial uses. So you're spot on there. But this is all on the national agenda. So my question is of a national interest. I heard the other day the Labour Party talking about reintroducing regional planning should they win the election in 2 years' time. What can you tell us about that, and what do you think of that?
Yeah, and I read the commission with real interest. I think where they're going is probably the right direction. I hope what they're doing, though, is trying to make sure that the bill and everything that's been put in place now fits with what they want to do, so that when they get, if they get in, a little slip there.
You sound like a newsreader from the south.
It's all right. It's all right, Catriona. We understand. We understand.
So if they win the next election, they don't throw the whole system up in the air. So I'm hoping that they will be working really hard behind the scenes to make sure for anything in the NPPF and the LRB fits with what they're looking at. Because, you know, for me, in terms of big regions, which I think is what they're proposing, devolution through big regions, it's quite hard to do planning from that scale all the way to the local scale. They'll need something in between. We always have had something in between, whether it's structured plans in the past or in regional days, all the real work was done through the local authorities and regional spatial strategies, through the sub-regional strategies. They were the ones that actually decided on housing numbers. They were the ones that decided on the spatial distribution. I go on the Goldilocks principle. Strategic planning has got to be done where it can give effect to national policies priorities, but also be local enough or small enough to reflect the different local context. It can't be too big or too small. So I think I like the direction of travel that Labour are going in. I think they've got an awful lot more thinking to do, but I think it's going in the right direction.
Super. Thank you very much, Chris, for that question. Paul, do you want to get your question in quickly? I know we're just past the hour.
Yeah, I'll certainly get my question in quickly. Can I just say on the issue of national development management policies, having spent an entire week at Places for Everyone with two KCs, other barristers, other consultants, all reinventing the wheel this week. If we had national development management policies that you could just adopt and they'd be presumed to be sound, you would save the country, the industry and the public sector a fortune.
Absolutely.
So fingers crossed. So anyway, it's a curse of aging, as well as wittering on like this. It's a curse of aging to start thinking that things were better in the past. So I wonder if that's true with planning as well. So if you could revoke any of the past reforms that you've seen during your career, what would it be? Reinstating RSS, getting rid of SIL, what would it be?
I would not have got rid of structure plans. I would not have replaced structure plans with regional spatial strategies.
And go back to RPGs.
Yeah, RPGs, and structure plans. RPGs were national policy. They weren't statutory plans, and they were so much easier to work with.
They were handed down by very clever people in the Department of the Environment. Yeah, I'm on the barricades with you, Catriona. Thank you.
Marvellous. And Rob, I'm just going to read out, if I may, Charlie's question, because we're hard up against it in terms of time. What's the one thing you'd most like to see in the NPPF prospectus when it's published later on in this month?
One thing, but I know it won't happen, is that spatial development strategies are mandatory right across the country.
Well, thank you so much. That was
Happy
a really
Christmas.
informative interview. And I honestly, the webinar chat has been, I need to read this later.
I've been trying to read it.
Yeah, it's hard to keep. Yeah, I know. You've done a fantastic job. Thank you so much. Thank you very much to our audience for their very active participation this evening. The good news is, ladies and gentlemen, we will be back in January. Can you believe it? When we will hopefully be hearing at some point in January from the Chief Planner, so we can continue the theme of this conversation. And Chris has got his finger up as if he'd like to say something.
One thing, okay? The Secretary of State, Lucy Fraser, the Minister, granted planning permission for 950 houses in the Greenbelt today.
York,
so
yesterday.
Don't believe the hype.
Yeah.
Congratulations,
indeed.
Paul.
Thank you very much.
Merry
Mr.
Christmas,
Tucker.
everybody.
So it's time to say goodbye and good night from all of us. A very Merry Christmas, and we very much look forward to you joining us again in 2023.
Thank you very much.
Merry Christmas.
Thank you, Catriona. Merry Christmas.
Thank you.